The sun was just starting to shine through the windows of Kensington Palace on that special May morning. Prince William stood in front of his mirror, fixing the medals on his uniform. Today was not just any day. It was the day his father, King Charles, would be crowned at Westminster Abbey. William took a deep breath. He felt both proud and nervous. Down the hall, Kate was already up and busy. She moved with quick steps, checking that everything was ready. Her dress, a beautiful light blue, had been picked months ago. Now it was hanging on the door, waiting to be worn. Kate stopped for a moment and looked at it. She thought about how much this day meant for the royal family and for the whole country. "Mummy, I can't find my shoes." The voice of Princess Charlotte broke the quiet. Kate smiled and went to help her daughter. Charlotte, at 8 years old, was excited about the big event. She had been talking about it for weeks, asking many questions about what would happen. "They're right here, darling," Kate said, pulling out the shiny black shoes from under Charlotte's bed. "Remember, we need to be ready in 1 hour." Charlotte nodded, her eyes big with excitement. "Will I get to wear a crown too?" she asked, putting on her shoes. Kate laughed softly. "No, sweetheart. Today is Grandpa's special day. He's the only one getting a crown." In his room, Prince George was much more serious. At 10 years old, he knew more about what it meant to be royal. He stood tall as a helper fixed his special outfit. George didn't say much, but he watched everything with careful eyes. He knew that one day, many years from now, he would be the one being crowned. The thought made him stand even taller. "Dad, look at me." 5-year-old Prince Louis ran into William's room, his tie crooked and his hair sticking up. William couldn't help but laugh. Even on the most important days, Louis was still just a happy little boy. "Come here, buddy," William said, kneeling down to fix Louis's tie. "Today is a very big day. We need to look our best for Grandpa." Louis nodded, trying to be serious. His grandpa scared to be king? He asked in his small voice. William thought for a moment. "Maybe a little nervous," he said, "but he's been getting ready for this day for a very long time, and we'll all be there to support him." The palace was now full of movement. Helpers rushed around, making sure everything was perfect. Security men talked into their radios. Outside, the streets of London were already filled with people, all waiting to see the royal family. At breakfast, William and Kate tried to keep things normal for the children. They ate toast and fruit while Kate went over the plan for the day. "Remember," she said, looking at each child, "there will be many people watching. We must be on our best behavior. And walk straight," William added with a smile. "No running, Louis." Louis giggled and took another bite of toast. Charlotte carefully wiped her mouth with a napkin, trying to be very proper. George just nodded, already thinking about the important job ahead. After breakfast, it was time to get dressed. Kate helped Charlotte with her dress and fixed her hair with a small clip that sparkled in the light. Charlotte stood very still, feeling like a real princess. The cars were waiting outside. Through the palace windows, they could see the crowds and the flags. The whole city seemed to be celebrating. William looked at his watch. It was almost time to leave for Westminster Abbey, where centuries of kings and queens had been crowned. His family would now be part of that long history. Kate came to stand beside him, looking beautiful in her dress and hat. "Ready?" she asked, taking his hand. William nodded. "Ready." He called to the children, and the family gathered by the door. The journey to Westminster Abbey was about to begin. The royal cars moved slowly through the streets of London. Inside the first car, Prince William looked out at the crowds. Thousands of people lined the roads, waving flags and cheering. Some had camped out all night just to get a good spot. William felt a mix of pride and pressure. All these people were here to see his family and to celebrate his father becoming king. "Look at all the people," Louis said, pressing his small face against the window. His eyes were wide with wonder. He waved his little hand, and the crowd cheered even louder. Remember to sit properly, Louis, Kate said gently, moving him back in his seat. But she was smiling. It was hard not to feel happy seeing so many people sharing in their special day. Charlotte sat very straight, waving with small, careful movements just like she had been taught. She loved seeing all the flags and the happy faces. Some people were even holding signs with her name on them. "They know who I am," she whispered to George, who sat beside her. George nodded. He was quieter than his siblings, feeling the weight of the day more deeply. One day, many years from now, this would be his father's crowning. And then, someday, his own. The thought made his stomach feel funny. "Are you okay?" William asked, noticing George's serious face. "Yes, Dad," George said, "just thinking." William put his hand on his son's shoulder. He understood. He had been young too when his grandmother became queen. He knew what it was like to see your future laid out before you. As they got closer to Westminster Abbey, the crowd grew even bigger. Police officers stood along the road, and soldiers in bright red uniforms stood at attention. The Abbey came into view, its tall towers reaching up to the blue sky. It had stood there for over 900 years, seeing the crowning of kings and queens through history. "It's so big," Louis said, looking up at the Abbey as their car stopped in front. "It's where kings and queens have been crowned for hundreds of years," Kate explained. "And today, your grandpa will join that long line." The family waited in the car until it was time to go in. Workers rushed around, making sure everything was perfect. News people with cameras stood behind barriers, trying to get the best pictures. "Remember what we talked about," William said to the children. "Walk slowly, smile, and stay close to us." The car door opened. The sound of the crowd hit them like a wave. Cheers and clapping filled the air. William stepped out first, then turned to help Kate. She looked beautiful in her blue dress and hat, with a small tiara sparkling in her hair. The children followed, blinking in the bright sunlight. Louis held tight to Kate's hand. Charlotte stayed close to George, who walked with his head high, trying to look as grown-up as possible. They moved slowly up the steps of the Abbey, just as they had practiced. Inside, the Abbey was cool and quiet compared to the noise outside. The high ceiling rose far above them, and colored light streamed through the stained glass windows. The space was filled with flowers and green plants. The smell of incense hung in the air. Important people from all over the world were already there. Kings and queens from other countries, presidents, prime ministers, and famous faces. They all turned to watch as William, Kate, and their children walked down the long aisle. Louis's eyes grew wide at the sight of so many grand people. He whispered something to Kate, who bent down to hear him better. "No, darling," she whispered back with a small smile. "You can't sit on the throne. That's just for Grandpa today." They were led to their special seats near the front of the Abbey. From here, they would have a perfect view of the ceremony. George sat up straight, trying to remember all the parts of the crowning that he had learned about. Charlotte adjusted her dress carefully. Louis swung his legs, already finding it hard to sit still. William looked across the Abbey and saw his father, King Charles, waiting in a small room to the side. Their eyes met for a moment. Charles gave a small nod, and William nodded back. It was a quiet moment between father and son, king and future king. The Abbey fell silent as the music began. The ceremony was about to start. The family sat together, ready to watch history being made. The music grew louder as the choir began to sing. Their voices filled every corner of Westminster Abbey. Prince Louis covered his ears for a moment, not used to such powerful sounds. Kate gently took his hands away and whispered something that made him smile. All heads turned as King Charles walked slowly down the long aisle. He wore a heavy robe of red and gold. His face was serious but calm. William felt a lump in his throat watching his father. This was the moment they had all been waiting for since Queen Elizabeth died. George sat up even straighter, his eyes never leaving his grandfather. "Is that the crown?" Charlotte whispered, pointing to a man walking behind Charles. The man carried a pillow with a large, sparkling crown on it. "That's the Street Edwards crown," William whispered back. "It's very old and very special. It's only used for the crowning." Louis's mouth opened in a small O as he looked at the crown. It was covered in jewels that caught the light from the windows. "It's so shiny," he said, a bit too loudly. Some people nearby smiled at his words. The Archbishop of Canterbury, wearing white and gold robes, stood at the front of the abbey. He would lead the ceremony, just as archbishops had done for hundreds of years. King Charles stopped in front of him and bowed his head. The ceremony was long, with many parts. There were prayers and promises. Charles had to swear to serve the people and to be fair and just. He placed his hand on the Bible as he made these promises. Kate noticed that Louis was starting to fidget. His little legs swung back and forth, and he played with the buttons on his coat. She gently placed her hand on his knee to remind him to be still. Charlotte watched everything with wide eyes, trying to remember all the details so she could tell her friends later. George looked thoughtful, imagining the day when his father would be in that same spot. Then came the most important moment. Charles sat in the ancient wooden chair that had been used for crownings for over 700 years. The Archbishop lifted the heavy Street Edwards crown high for everyone to see. The abbey fell completely silent. "God save the King," the Archbishop said, and slowly lowered the crown onto Charles's head. "God save the King," everyone in the abbey repeated loudly. Louis jumped a little at the sudden noise. William felt a strange mix of feelings watching his father become king. He was proud, but also sad thinking about his grandmother, who was no longer with them. Kate squeezed his hand, knowing what he was feeling without him saying a word. After the crowning, there were more prayers and songs. The new king was given a round ball called an orb and a special stick called a scepter. These were symbols of his power and duty. "Why does he need a ball?" Louis asked, not understanding. "It shows that he is king of the whole world," George explained, remembering what he had learned. "Well, not really the whole world, but it's a symbol." Louis nodded, though he didn't fully understand. Some things about being royal were very strange and old-fashioned. When Charles stood up wearing the crown and holding the royal objects, trumpets began to play. The sound was loud and proud, filling the huge space of the abbey. Charlotte's eyes lit up at the exciting noise. Even Louis stopped fidgeting to listen. The new king turned slowly, looking at all the people who had come to see this historic moment. When he faced where his family sat, his serious face softened just a little. William nodded to his father, showing his support without words. Kate smiled warmly. The children sat up tall, knowing this was a moment they would remember all their lives. People began to cheer inside the abbey. "Long live the king! Long live the king!" The words echoed off the stone walls and high ceiling. Outside, the crowds who were watching on big screens joined in the cheering. Bells began to ring from church towers all across London. Cannons fired in a royal salute. The noise could be heard even inside the thick walls of the abbey. "Grandpa really is king now," Charlotte whispered, her voice filled with wonder. William nodded. "Yes, he really is. And one day, a long time from now, it will be my turn." And then, many years after that, George's turn. George swallowed hard, thinking about that far-off day. It seemed both exciting and scary to think about. For now, though, he was just proud to be here, watching his grandfather's big moment. After the crowning, King Charles stood up and began to walk slowly down from the front of the abbey. The heavy crown sat firmly on his head. He looked both proud and serious as he took his first steps as the crowned king. Everyone in the abbey stood up to show respect. Louis tugged at Kate's dress. "Is it over now?" he whispered. He had been sitting still for a very long time, and it was hard for a 5-year-old. "Not yet, darling," Kate whispered back. "There's a big parade after this, and then we'll see Grandpa on the palace balcony." Louis's face brightened at the mention of the parade. He loved parades with all the soldiers and horses and music. As King Charles passed by their row, William and his family bowed and curtsied. Even little Louis tried his best to bow, though he wobbled a bit. Charles gave them a small smile as he passed. It wasn't a big smile. He had to stay serious for this important moment, but his eyes showed how happy he was to see his family there. The next part of the ceremony was in a different part of the abbey. The family followed a group of important people through a side door into a small room with beautiful old paintings on the walls. Here, Charles sat on another special chair while people came forward to kneel before him and promised to serve him. These were the lords and ladies of the country, following a tradition that was hundreds of years old. Charlotte watched with wide eyes as these grand people in their fancy clothes knelt before her grandfather. "Will I have to do that too?" she asked her mother. "No, sweetheart," Kate said softly. "You're his family. You just have to show respect in other ways." George stood near his father, watching everything carefully. He knew that one day, many years from now, people would kneel before his father, and then someday before him. The thought made him stand up straighter. After this part was finished, there was a moment when the family could speak to Charles privately. They moved to a small side room where no cameras were allowed. Here, away from all the watching eyes, Charles was just their father and grandfather again. "You did so well," William said, placing a hand on his father's shoulder. "Did the crown hurt, Grandpa?" Louis asked, looking up at the heavy gold crown. Charles laughed gently. "It is rather heavy," he admitted, carefully touching the edge of it, "but worth it to see your faces watching me." Charlotte stepped forward. "You look just like a king in a storybook," she said with a smile. "The best kind of king," George added seriously. Charles's eyes grew a bit wet at his grandchildren's words. Even on this most formal of days, their simple love meant the most to him. This quiet family moment didn't last long. Soon, a palace worker came in to tell them it was time for the next part. They would now leave the abbey and ride in a grand parade back to Buckingham Palace. Outside, the crowds had grown even bigger. People had been waiting for hours to see the new king and his family. When the great doors of Westminster Abbey opened, a huge cheer went up from the thousands of people. The noise was so loud that Louis covered his ears again. Kate bent down and whispered something to him. He nodded and put his hands down, though he still looked a bit worried by all the noise. A line of soldiers in bright red uniforms stood ready. Behind them were beautiful horses pulling the golden state coach. This coach was very old and had been used by kings and queens for hundreds of years. It shone in the sunlight, its gold decorations gleaming. "We get to ride in that," Charlotte gasped, pointing at the beautiful coach. William nodded. "The king and Queen Camilla will ride in that one. We'll be in the coach behind them." The children watched as Charles and Camilla walked slowly down the steps of the abbey. Camilla now wore a smaller crown, showing she was queen. They moved carefully toward the golden coach, stopping often to wave at the cheering crowds. Then it was William and Kate's turn to lead their children down the steps. Cameras flashed all around them, capturing every moment. William held George's shoulder gently, guiding him. Kate held Louis's hand tightly so he wouldn't get too excited and run off. Charlotte walked between her brothers, waving happily at the people. The royal coaches lined up outside Westminster Abbey like something from a fairy tale. The golden state coach that carried King Charles and Queen Camilla led the way. William, Kate, and their children climbed into the second coach. It wasn't as fancy as the king's coach, but it was still beautiful, with red seats and big windows so people could see them. "Wave to the people," Kate reminded the children as they settled into their seats. "They've been waiting all day to see us." The coach began to move. It rolled slowly down the street, pulled by 4 white horses. Soldiers on horseback rode beside them. The crowds on both sides of the street cheered and waved flags. Some people threw flowers that landed on the road in front of the coaches. Louis bounced on his seat with excitement. "Look at all the soldiers," he cried, pointing at the men in bright red uniforms who marched behind their coach. "Those are the king's guards," George told his brother. "They protect the royal family." Charlotte waved through the window, copying the elegant wave that Kate used. She felt very grown-up and royal. "Someone has a sign with my name on it," she said happily, spotting a little girl holding a pink poster. The coach rolled down the mall, the wide road that leads to Buckingham Palace. Trees lined both sides, and even more people stood behind barriers, cheering as the royal family passed. Some were crying with happiness. Others sang "God Save the King" as the coaches went by. "Why are some people crying?" Louis asked, noticing a woman wiping tears from her face. "They're happy tears," William explained. "This is a very special day that some people have waited their whole lives to see." As their coach turned a corner, they could see Buckingham Palace in the distance. Its cream-colored walls and many windows stood out against the blue sky. The royal flag flew from the roof, showing that the king was out but would return soon. Inside the coach, Kate straightened Louis's tie again. It had come loose during all his excited bouncing. "Soon we'll be at the palace," she said, "and then we'll go out on the balcony to wave to everyone." Louis's eyes grew wide. The balcony? The high-up one? He had been on the palace balcony before, but not many times. It was a special treat. "Yes, the very same one," William said with a smile. "All the kings and queens have stood there to wave to the people." The closer they got to the palace, the bigger the crowds became. People were packed together, waving flags and taking pictures with their phones. Some sat on their friends' shoulders to see better. Children sat on their parents' laps, trying to spot the royal family in the coaches. "There must be millions of people," Charlotte said, amazed by the sea of faces. "Not quite millions," William said with a laugh, "but certainly thousands and thousands." The golden gates of Buckingham Palace came into view. Palace guards stood at attention as the gates slowly opened for the royal coaches. The king's coach went through first, then William and Kate's coach followed. Once inside the palace grounds, they were away from the crowds. The garden was quiet and peaceful after all the noise outside. The coaches stopped at the back entrance to the palace, where steps led up to a red carpet. Helpers rushed forward to open the coach doors. King Charles and Queen Camilla stepped out of their coach first. Charles still wore his crown, though it looked even heavier now after wearing it for hours. When William and Kate's coach door opened, Louis was the first to jump out, eager to stretch his legs after sitting still for so long. Kate quickly caught his hand before he could run off. Charlotte stepped down carefully, holding her dress so she wouldn't trip. George moved with calm dignity, like a mini version of his father. Inside the palace, everything was busy. Workers rushed around, making sure all was ready for the balcony appearance. Other royal family members who had been at the Abbey in different coaches were now arriving too. The grand hallways of Buckingham Palace filled with people in their finest clothes, all talking excitedly about the ceremony. "When do we go on the balcony?" Charlotte asked, her eyes shining with excitement. "Soon," Kate promised. "First, Grandpa needs to rest for a few minutes. The crown is very heavy, and he's been wearing it for a long time." Louis tugged at William's hand. "Can I try the crown on?" he asked hopefully. William laughed and shook his head. "No, Louis. That crown is just for the king." They followed a palace worker through the grand rooms of the palace. Paintings of past kings and queens looked down from the walls. Fancy furniture that was hundreds of years old sat in every room. Louis wanted to touch everything, but Kate gently reminded him to keep his hands to himself. In a grand room inside Buckingham Palace, the royal family gathered to wait for the balcony appearance. Large windows looked out over the palace gardens, and old paintings hung on the walls. Soft chairs and couches gave everyone a place to rest after the long ceremony. King Charles had finally taken off his heavy crown. It sat on a special cushion, watched by a guard. Charles rubbed his head where the crown had been pressing down all morning. "Does your head hurt, Grandpa?" Louis asked, noticing this. "A little," Charles admitted with a smile. "That crown is very heavy. It's made of real gold, you know." Louis nodded, his eyes wide. "It looked very heavy. I don't think I want to wear one. You won't have to, Charlotte told her little brother. Only kings and queens wear crowns. George stood by a window, looking out at the huge crowd that filled the area in front of the palace. More people than he could count were waiting to see the royal family on the balcony. He felt a mix of excitement and nervousness about standing in front of so many people. William came to stand beside his son. Quite a view, isn't it? He said quietly. George nodded. There are so many people, he said, and they're all looking at us. That's part of being in this family, William said, putting his hand on George's shoulder. People look to us. But remember, they're happy to see us. They're celebrating today. In another part of the room, Kate was helping Charlotte fix her hair, which had come a bit loose during the coach ride. You've been so good today, Kate said, tucking a strand of hair behind Charlotte's ear. It's been a long day for everyone, Kate added, looking across at Louis, who was now sitting on a couch, his little legs swinging back and forth. He looked tired but was trying hard to stay awake and alert for the balcony appearance. A palace worker came into the room. Your Majesty, he said, bowing to King Charles. The crowds are ready. We should proceed to the balcony in 5 minutes. Charles nodded. He stood up straighter, ready for his first balcony appearance as the crowned king. Queen Camilla came to stand beside him, her smaller crown still on her head. Children, come here, please, Kate called. Louis jumped off the couch and ran to his mother. Charlotte walked more carefully, trying to be ladylike. George turned from the window and joined his family. Now remember, William said, looking at each child, when we go out on the balcony, stand still and wave nicely. No jumping or running, Louis. He gave his youngest son a knowing look. I'll be good, Daddy, Louis promised, though his eyes still sparkled with excitement. And remember to smile, Kate added. People have come from all over the world to see us today. Charlotte practiced her royal wave, moving her hand gracefully from side to side. Louis tried to copy her, but his wave was much more energetic. George just nodded, already understanding what was expected of him. The palace worker returned. It's time, Your Majesty, he said to Charles. The family lined up in order. King Charles and Queen Camilla would go first, then William and Kate, followed by George, Charlotte, and Louis. They walked through the grand rooms of the palace toward the balcony doors. The sound of the crowd outside grew louder with each step. Louis reached up to hold Kate's hand as they walked. Even though he was excited, the noise of the crowd was a little scary. Charlotte walked tall, keeping her chin up like she had seen Kate do. George walked beside his father, trying to match William's confident stride. They reached the tall glass doors that led to the balcony. Through the glass, they could see the balcony with its white stone railing. Beyond that was a sea of people filling the mall as far as they could see. Red, white, and blue flags waved in the air. The roar of the crowd was loud even through the closed doors. Ready? Charles asked, looking back at his family. Everyone nodded. The palace workers opened the glass doors. Bright sunlight streamed in, along with the full sound of the cheering crowd. The noise was huge, like nothing the children had ever heard before. Louis's eyes grew wide, and he squeezed Kate's hand tighter. It's all right, Kate whispered to him. Just stay close to me. Charles took a deep breath and stepped out onto the balcony. Queen Camilla walked beside him. The cheers grew even louder as the crowd saw their new king and queen. Charles raised his hand in greeting, and the people roared their approval. William and Kate stepped onto the balcony next, following King Charles and Queen Camilla. The crowd's cheers grew even louder when they appeared. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The children stepped out into the sunshine. First George, then Charlotte, and finally little Louis. The noise was amazing. Thousands of people filled the area in front of the palace, and they all seemed to be shouting at once. The sound bounced off buildings and seemed to shake the air itself. Louis's mouth dropped open at the sight of so many people looking up at them. Wave, Louis, Kate reminded him gently. Louis lifted his hand and began to wave. When the crowd cheered even louder in response, a big smile spread across his face. Charlotte was waving too, her small hand moving from side to side just as she had practiced. She stood up very straight, trying to look as royal as possible. George waved more slowly, taking in the incredible scene before him. From this high balcony, the crowd seemed to stretch forever, a sea of happy faces and waving flags. King Charles stepped forward to the edge of the balcony. This was his moment, his first balcony appearance as the crowned King of England. The gold crown had been left inside, but he still wore his royal robes. He raised both hands to the crowd, and they roared their approval. William felt a mix of pride and emotion watching his father. This day had been coming for many years, but now that it was here, it felt both strange and wonderful. Kate stood close beside him, her face glowing with happiness. Their family was at the center of this historic moment. Louis tugged at William's sleeve. "Daddy, are all these people here just to see us?" he asked, his voice full of wonder. William bent down to speak to his son. "They're here to see Grandpa become king," he explained. "But they're very happy to see you too." A formation of planes suddenly appeared in the sky above the palace. They flew in perfect lines, leaving trails of red, white, and blue smoke behind them, the colors of the British flag. The crowd gasped and pointed upward. "Look," Charlotte cried, pointing at the sky. "They're making our flag." The planes roared overhead, the noise even louder than the cheering crowd. Louis covered his ears, but he was smiling with excitement. George watched with wide eyes as the planes made patterns in the sky. "It's the Royal Air Force," William told the children. "They're doing a special flyover for Grandpa's big day." The royal family stood together, watching the air show. Charles put his arm around Camilla. William stood tall next to his father, with Kate beside him. The three children stayed in front, where everyone could see them. They made a perfect picture of the royal family, the past, present, and future of the monarchy all together on one balcony. Photographers below snapped thousands of pictures. This image would be on the front of newspapers around the world tomorrow. Louis, now over his initial shyness, was waving with both hands. Charlotte was beaming, enjoying every minute of the attention. George remained more serious, understanding the importance of the day. When the planes finished their display and flew away, the crowd began to sing. The sound of thousands of voices singing "God Save the King" rose up to the balcony. It was an old song with new meaning today. Charles stood very still, listening to the song that was now about him. William noticed that his father's eyes looked wet with emotion. This was the moment when it all became real. Charles was truly king now. The crown, the ceremony, the balcony appearance, it was all part of a tradition that had lasted for hundreds of years. The singing ended, and Charles waved one more time to the crowd. Then he turned to his family and nodded. It was time to go back inside. They had been on the balcony for just a few minutes, but it was a moment none of them would ever forget. As they turned to walk back through the glass doors, Louis suddenly stopped and gave one final big wave to the crowd. People laughed and cheered at the little prince's enthusiasm. Kate smiled and gently guided him inside, followed by Charlotte and George. Back in the palace room, away from the eyes of the public, the family relaxed. Louis ran straight to a window to look out at the crowd again. Charlotte carefully smoothed her dress, which had blown in the wind on the balcony. George stood quietly, thinking about everything he had seen today. "You all did wonderfully," Charles told them, his voice warm with pride. The perfect royal family. William put his arm around Kate. Together, they watched their children, who had just been part of one of the biggest royal events of their young lives. They had witnessed history being made, and someday they would be part of making history themselves. After the balcony appearance, the family moved to a large dining room in Buckingham Palace. A special lunch had been prepared to celebrate the crowning. The long table was covered with a white cloth and set with the best plates, cups, and silverware. Flowers in red, white, and blue colors sat in the middle of the table. I'm hungry, Louis announced as they entered the room. Everyone laughed. It had been a long morning, and no one had eaten much before the ceremony. Me too, Charlotte agreed, looking at all the food that was being brought in by palace workers. King Charles sat at the head of the table, with Queen Camilla beside him. William sat on Charles's other side, with Kate next to him. The children sat together, with George helping Louis get settled in his chair. "Can I take my jacket off now?" Louis asked, pulling at the collar of his formal outfit. He had been wearing it for hours and was tired of being so dressed up. "Yes, you may," Kate said with a smile. She helped him slip off the small blue jacket. Charlotte and George also removed their formal outer layers, happy to be more comfortable. The food looked delicious. There was roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, and fresh bread. For dessert, there were small cakes decorated with crowns made of sugar. The children's eyes grew wide at the sight of these special treats. As they began to eat, Charles raised his glass. "To family," he said simply. The adults raised their glasses too. The children lifted their water glasses, feeling very grown up. "The best part of today," Charles continued, looking around the table, "was having all of you with me. Thank you for making this day even more special." William nodded, feeling proud of how well his children had behaved during the long ceremony. "They were perfect," he said, "even with all those people watching." Louis was already eating a piece of chicken. "The planes were my favorite part," he said between bites. "They were so loud." "I liked the singing in the Abbey," Charlotte said. "The choir's voices were beautiful." George thought for a moment before speaking. "I liked when they put the crown on Grandpa's head," he said quietly. "That was the moment he really became king." Charles smiled at his grandson. "That was my favorite moment too," he said, "though it was a very heavy crown." As they ate, they talked about the day. Each person had noticed different things during the ceremony. Charlotte had loved the music and the flowers in the Abbey. Louis had been impressed by the soldiers in their red uniforms. George had watched the ancient rituals with deep interest, knowing they would be part of his life someday too. "Did you see the lady who tripped on her dress?" Louis asked with a giggle. Kate gave him a gentle look, reminding him not to laugh at others. "I saw someone crying when Grandpa walked past," Charlotte said. "Happy tears, right, Moni?" Kate nodded. "Yes, many people felt very emotional today. It's a historic moment they'll remember all their lives." Outside the palace, the celebrations continued. They could hear music and cheering from the crowds who were still filling the streets of London. The whole city was having a party to celebrate the new king. "Will there be fireworks tonight?" Louis asked hopefully, his mouth now smeared with chocolate from a small cake. "Yes, there will be," William said, passing his son a napkin to wipe his face. "But they'll be quite late. I'm not sure you'll be awake to see them." Louis's face fell a little. "But I want to see them. I'm not tired at all." Even as he said this, he tried to hide it on. Everyone smiled. It had been a very long and exciting day, especially for a 5-year-old. Charlotte was looking sleepy too, though she was trying hard not to show it. Even George, who was older, seemed tired from all the excitement. After lunch, the family moved to a comfortable sitting room. The formal part of the day was over, and now they could relax together. Outside, the celebration would continue long into the night, but inside the palace, the royal family could finally have some quiet time. Louis climbed onto William's lap, his energy finally running out. Charlotte sat next to Kate, leaning against her mother's side. George chose a chair near his grandfather, still wanting to be close to the new king. "You children were so brave today," Charles told them. "Standing in front of all those people isn't easy, even for grown-ups." "Were you scared, Grandpa?" Charlotte asked, looking up at him with curious eyes. Charles thought for a moment. "A little nervous, perhaps," he admitted. "I didn't want to make any mistakes." "But you didn't," George said confidently. "You did everything right." Charles smiled at his grandson. "Thank you, George. That means a lot to me." As they sat together, palace workers came in with tea for the adults and juice for the children. The formal meals and ceremonies would continue tomorrow, but for now, they were just a family, sharing a special day together. Evening fell over London, and the sky turned a deep blue. Lights came on all over the city, making it sparkle like a jewel. Inside Buckingham Palace, the royal family was getting ready for the last event of this special day, watching the fireworks. Louis had fallen asleep on a couch after lunch, his small body finally giving in to tiredness. Kate had covered him with a soft blanket and let him rest. Now, William was gently waking him up. "Louis, do you want to see the fireworks?" William asked softly, touching his son's shoulder. Louis opened his sleepy eyes. "Fireworks?" he mumbled, then suddenly sat up, fully awake. "Yes. Are they starting now?" "Soon," William said with a smile. "We're going to watch them from the palace roof garden. It has the best view." Charlotte was already dressed in a warm coat over her dress. The May evening was cool, and they would be outside for the fireworks display. She was helping George find his coat too. Both children were tired but excited about staying up late for this special treat. "Will it be very loud?" Charlotte asked as Kate helped her button her coat. "Quite loud," Kate admitted, "but you can cover your ears if you need to." King Charles and Queen Camilla had changed into more comfortable clothes too. Charles looked much more relaxed now that the formal parts of the day were over. He had taken off his royal robes and crown hours ago, and now wore a simple dark suit. "Are we all ready?" Charles asked, looking around at his family. Louis ran to his grandfather's side. "Ready, Grandpa King," he said, using the new nickname he had made up during their afternoon tea. Charles laughed and took Louis's small hand. "Then let's go see those fireworks, shall we?" The family followed a palace worker up several flights of stairs. They went through parts of the palace that most people never saw. Finally, they'd reached a door that led out to a roof garden. This special place was hidden from the public, high above the busy streets of London. When they stepped outside, they could see the whole city spread out before them. Lights twinkled everywhere. The River Thames looked like a dark ribbon with bright bridges crossing it. Big Ben stood tall in the distance, its face lit up against the night sky. "Wow," George said softly, looking at the amazing view. "It's like a fairy tale," Charlotte added, her eyes wide with wonder. Special chairs had been set up for them to sit on. There were even small blankets to keep them warm in the cool night air. Louis climbed onto William's lap, snuggling close for warmth and comfort. "Look at all the people," Kate said, pointing down to the mall in front of the palace. Even though it was now dark, the street was still filled with people celebrating. They could hear music playing and see small lights moving as people held up their phones. "They're still celebrating Grandpa's big day," George said. Charles nodded, touched by the sight of so many people still out in the streets. "It's been a wonderful day," he said, "one I will never forget." Suddenly, there was a loud boom, and the first firework shot into the sky. It exploded in a burst of red and gold, lighting up the night. Louis gasped and grabbed William's hand. "It's okay," William assured him. "Just watch. They're beautiful." More fireworks followed, filling the sky with color and light. Blue, red, green, and gold sparks rained down over the city. Some made patterns like crowns or the letters C for Charles. Others simply burst into huge circles of light. Charlotte's face glowed in the light of the fireworks. "They're so pretty," she whispered, her eyes fixed on the colorful display. Even George, who was usually so serious, was smiling with delight at the spectacular show. He sat close to his mother, occasionally pointing out a particularly impressive firework. As they watched the beautiful display, Kate thought about what an important day this had been for their family. The children had seen history being made. They had been part of an ancient ceremony that connected them to hundreds of years of tradition. "What are you thinking about?" William asked her quietly, noticing her thoughtful expression. "Just about today," Kate replied. "About how the children will remember this all their lives." William nodded, understanding. A day to tell their own children about someday, he said. Louis suddenly pointed to the sky. Look, that one looks like a giant crown. He cried as a huge gold firework spread across the night. It was the grand finale of the fireworks show. Dozens of fireworks shot into the air at once, lighting up the sky in a dazzling display of color. The noise was tremendous, but none of the children covered their ears. They were too amazed by the beautiful sight. As the last sparks faded from the sky, Charles put his arm around William's shoulders. 3 generations of the royal family stood together, the past, present, and future of the monarchy. Today had been Charles's day, but someday it would be William's turn. And then, many years from now, George. Time for bed, I think, Kate said as Louis yawned widely. The family turned to go back inside the palace. Tomorrow would bring more ceremonies and celebrations, but the main event, the crowning itself, was now part of history. They had all played their parts perfectly, from the oldest to the youngest. As they walked back through the palace halls, Louis looked up at his father. "Daddy," he said sleepily, "it was a good day, wasn't it?" William smiled down at his youngest son. "Yes, Louis," he agreed. "It was a very good day indeed."